Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in France on a three-nation trip through Europe designed to try to at least bolster ties, even as trade tensions do mount. We talked about just the significance of this, right? This is the first visit to the region in 5 years for the president. And Xi's tour comes as the EU forges a more unified voice with Washington in opposing China's capacity for cheap exports and perceived national security risks. Now, during his European leg, Xi Jinping aims to highlight some of these economic opportunities for the EU, maybe some opportunities for Chinese investment, certainly, and seeking France's support in encouraging the EU to adopt a more pragmatic approach. In return, the French President Emmanuel Macron also hopes Xi can facilitate peace efforts in the Ukraine war and address issues over Chinese investments in France's EV battery sector. So a lot on the agenda, Dave.
A lot, yeah, and of course France, and then the president, of course, moves to Hungary and, of course, a non-EU member, Serbia, to really delve deeper into all of this, the significance of this. Of course, there's a sort of nuance per place and the big picture, geopolitically speaking. We're joined right now by Jörg Wutke, President Emeritus at the European Chamber of Commerce in China, and also joining us too is Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology. Jörg, let me start with you. You've been on the ground, of course, in many years from China, and just perfect person to really set this up for us. Initially, my thought when I heard the news was, why France and not Germany? But maybe you could answer the significance of that. Why France?
Well, first of all, we had Chancellor Scholz in China just about 2 weeks ago, so it doesn't really make sense that Scholz and Xi Jinping meet again 2 weeks, nothing really happened. As a matter of fact, the Scholz visit was not really very fruitful. So it really makes sense to look up the biggest other nation in Europe, which is France, and Macron plays it quite well. He has invited EU Commission President von der Leyen to join him. And so it's a good sequence. And of course, then he moves on into Serbia to the anniversary of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and then, of course, to the closest friend they have in the European Union, which is Hungary. So it's quite a very symbolic visit.
Warwick, chime in here. I mean, do you think there's anything that the Chinese president can do to avoid its relationship with Europe to deteriorate the way that it has with the U.S.?
Well, China just needs to put its own best foot forward. China will advance its own interests and its own perspectives on what is in the mutual interests of all concerned, and ultimately it'll be up to other parties as to how they respond to that. China has made it very clear for a long time that it seeks win-win cooperative relationships with other countries, and certainly I don't think fundamentally there are any conflicts of interest between these countries. So the objective material foundations for solid relationships are there. It's just a question of whether psychologically and emotionally the Europeans and the transatlantic powers are able to come to the party of a changing multipolar world.
Yeah, and Warwick, just to follow up on that, I mean, these meetings are taking place not in a vacuum, and certainly a lot of geopolitical events. Of course, you have the war in Ukraine, what's taking place, of course, between Hamas and Israel. It's an election year in the U.S., and I'm wondering, Warwick, what role does each one play or give the other as far as their geopolitical strategy is concerned? So what does France offer China and vice versa?
Yeah, I think it's important to take half a step back and probably not look at these issues so much in transactional terms, but look at them in broad historical transitional terms. And what's going on is that globally the epicenter of economic power, if you will, and economic growth is shifting towards Asia, and it's concentrating in Asia. And the European and transatlantic countries in general need to adapt to that changing environment. Now, in terms of the conflicts, in some ways, they're symptomatic of a changing global order, and they're symptomatic because we're starting to see the traditional powers fighting tooth and nail to hold on to what they think they've got.
You've worked in China for decades. You've worked in the auto industry, so you know what's really happening on the ground. Is there a growing sense of frustration now of these concerns about China's overcapacity and exporting too aggressively? Or is there still some sentiment out there that still thinks that China is a market of plenty of opportunities?
Well, first of all, I guess Scholz has mentioned this. Macron will mention it as Janet Yellen said so in Guangzhou. China has huge overcapacity problems, which, of course, are challenging its trading partners, not just Europe and the US, but also, of course, Brazil and other countries. But China lives in denial and says there is no overcapacity. So she just has to bear this and listen to it all over again. I think that also she has to realize that Europe is basically using the new toolbox they built up. There has been new anti-dumping cases. There has been a subsidy case going on EVs, which possibly will come to conclusion in June already. And then you have also procurement. They more or less killed the Chinese bit in Bulgarian trade. So China has to realize that Europe has its own policy, its own trade policy, and will actually use its new toolbox. So the time of good words and warm words is over. China has to do something about more opening up in order to balance the kind of trade that we wish we would have with China.
Warwick, let me get your thoughts on the same topic. I know you have some views here on whether or not there is overcapacity, whether or not it's a relevant topic to a conversation to be had. Just give us your thoughts there, Warwick.
The idea of overcapacity is a furphy. It's raised largely by countries with incumbent industries that have failed to adapt to technological change, and they're obviously facing competition. The fact is that trading nations around the world have undercapacity and overcapacity in different areas, depending on what they're capable of and what they're good at. The fact of the matter is that the European Union needs to find ways to adapt to the changing technological and market landscape. And one of the ways in which it can actually do that is to welcome foreign investment to build up its own productive capacity so that it can be competitive.
What about EU tariffs on Chinese exports? Is that a real risk now? How close are we really when it comes to a possible trade war between the EU and China now?
We are not very far away, and overcapacity is an issue as China produces 2.5 times global demand in solar panels, for example. China can produce 50 million cars. Itself consumes 23 million. Actually, what I was also telling Janet Yellen in Guangzhou is that overcapacity is already a huge problem within China because everybody produces stuff and nobody makes money. And Europe is the last big market open for cars and for other items, and China should be very interested to actually maintain that. Trade imbalance is at an all-time high. We had 3 years ago 3.4 containers going to Europe and only one came back. This year we will face 4 to 1. China is indeed an export powerhouse, but it has to realize that Europe is not going to stay open forever.
Yeah, and the other side. The other side to that same coin is, the lack of FDI into China in recent years, or the drop off we've seen from trend. Do you think that is a function of overcapacity in sectors that were actually magnets for FDI? And if you think so as well, what opportunities do you see for foreign capital to play a part in Chinese? Which sectors do you see the most runway, Jörg?
Well, first of all, in the equity side, as I said, nobody makes money, or very few companies make money. Actually, China, in many ways, is non-investable. The market has been underperforming quite a bit. But in the real economy, China remains extremely interesting. In the car industry, you see European, in particular German companies, pouring billions into this economy. Still, the chemical industry is pouring billions into this economy. So when it comes to real investment into concrete and steel, Europe is not letting go. Actually, they are doing more in order to actually catch up with China. And as Warwick was saying, we actually in Europe are very keen to have Chinese investors putting up shop in Europe. CATL has 2 plants, one already running in East Germany, one is building in Hungary. We want BYD to operate there. So unlike in the US, Europe is very keen in order to have the Chinese investors actually helping us to bridge the gap, because in many ways the Chinese have gone already much more ahead of us, particularly in the car industry.
So Warwick, from the China perspective, is there any sort of room for concessions in this trip? And is it more going to be on the trade side? Or what about the strategic partnership with Russia? Is there any sort of leeway there either?
Look, on the trade side, I think the objective is to maintain open trade, and open trade will drive the allocation of capital, hopefully with the ability for new capabilities to augment European production systems. I mean, over the last 10 to 15 years, European production systems have, in terms of some of these new areas, the new energy areas, have fallen behind. Having said that, European car manufacturers continue to export substantially into markets like China, particularly in the internal combustion engine space. So, we haven't heard a lot of complaints about overcapacity in European manufacturers for the last 15 years. So, let's be fair about this. What we're witnessing at the moment is just transformation, industrial transformation that requires upskilling and the adoption of new technologies and know-how. And by working together, there's actually a much better chance of achieving that and achieving the investment and trade flows that deliver better living standards for people all across the Eurasian continent.
Warwick, just if you could elaborate on that, that's an important point, I believe. Well, let me rephrase it simply. Do you think the Chinese are coming into this conversation from a from a position of expertise in bringing in that technology? And Jörg, I want you to respond to that just after that. But yeah, go ahead, Warwick.
Well, certainly in some of the areas that have been identified as of particular concern, it's incumbent industries in the traditional markets that have fallen behind, and yet that is the direction of the world. Green development, decarbonisation, new energy technologies, whether it's in transportation or energy storage or energy generation, are going to be critical to achieving the climate change objectives that pretty much all nations have agreed to. Now, if we're serious about those transitions, then the least cost, fastest way is the way that people should be going. And if we can do that, it'll actually catalyse downstream industrial development opportunities taking advantage of lower cost, cleaner energies.
Yeah, your thoughts on that, and also how does Macron sell that domestically, that the Chinese are coming in with good stuff?
Yeah. Well, first of all, China has 60% of global manufacturing capacity. They are standing for 31% of global manufacturing added value. So virtually every third product worldwide being produced is made in China. But China stands for only 14% of global consumption. So there's a serious mismatch in what they push into the international markets and actually what they consume. And that will be mentioned by Macron clearly. And the fact of that is we have 126 car companies in China, which already China finds not sustainable. So something has to give, and China has to actually let market forces reign. Companies have to go bankrupt there in order to get off the market, in order to also let the top players get a little bit of more price margins. And that's going to be very, very difficult in the process, but it has to be done also for the sake of the Chinese domestic economy. And let's see if Xi Jinping is listening or if he remains to live in denial on overcapacity when he leaves France.
Jörg, maybe a last question now. If Donald Trump returns to office, does it change the game in any way, the relationship between the EU and China?
I don't think so. I mean, we had Trump 1, and we both suffered tremendously from the Trump administration. We had a trade war, we Europeans with the US, and China didn't give us anything. I don't think that actually China took advantage of that. In many ways, I think, yes, we're both in the doldrums if Trump gets elected in Lighthizer.
There is exports, of course, but the majority of Chinese manufacturers, including the growth across all sectors, has been consumed by domestic industry and domestic households.
Yeah, as you say, there's a bit of an undercapacity issue, according to Warwick. Warwick, it's great to have you. Thank you so much. And Jörg Wicke, President Emeritus at European Chamber of Commerce in China, and Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. Markets are looking like this year. Of course, we've been tracking what's been going on Shanghai, and certainly that return from the holidays has been looking very good, and we're watching very closely these chip sales.